is 4x. This is polymorphously perverse content beyond this point. We are not in the realm of the normal. All right? If that's going to be too difficult, you are always welcome to find the sunlight. All right, let me see if I can do this now. So just move me ahead. Very sexy, huh? I had that tutorial on Friday. That was very good. Bless his heart. All right, now I thought if you don't confuse them with the first title, you should always confuse them with a second title so they don't know what you're talking about and you can get out early. All right, so Gore Vidal wrote this wonderful article back in The Nation, which was hilarious, called Monotheism and Its Discontents, which I liked, so I used it. I say a personal view because this is, of course, mine, so I selected these things. He's, of course, playing off Freud's famous book, Civilization and Its Discontents, which in German, das Unbehagen in der Kultur. Now, that's a very interesting title for me, because what most of this lecture is going to be about is the uneasy human relationship between our animal nature as primates and this other thing that we've stuck onto it, which no other animal has, culture. And the whole of human history has been this, as Freud says, das Unbehagen, the uneasiness, the tension between our Darwinian inheritance as primates and this other extra thing we've added on with language. And it's never been behagen. It's never been easy. All right? Next. Sexy. All right. Cool. My students would say this. All right, I better have an overview so we see where the trajectory, the telos, as Aristotle would say. I'm going to be working within the intellectual system called cultural materialism, which is a development of historical materialism. Basically what that means is I'm working in a Darwinian materialist concept that thinks that we really should start with our animal material existence rather than the ideas, and that our ideas are formed from our material existence. It's very Darwinian, very Marxist, very materialist. All right? We're going to go back to the origins of monotheism in Egypt and Israel. We're going to talk about monotheism's effects on society and personality and formation, what it's done to us. We're going to talk about polytheism and paganism and its social consequences and the invention of the nude, democracy, and gymnasium. All right? And what a radical different world that is from monotheism. Then we're going to do a little bit on Christianity's view of the body and how we've tried to recover from it. And I want to make you realize that I'm going to be reading the body as text and ideology. I know you all think these things are absolutely self-evident, that you wake up in the morning, you look at yourself in the bathroom, and you say, that's me. Well, by the end of this lecture, you may have second thoughts. That you don't realize how much that had to be constructed. And that everything you're doing from right now, sitting there, grooming yourself the way you've looked, is an ideological construction. All right? For a particular society, a particular way you want to be gazed at and gazed. Nothing is simple. All right, some basic things. Cultural materialism, you want to go on. Marvin Harris coined the word. Everybody should read his Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches, and Cannibals and Kings. Jared Diamond is in the same tradition. Guns, Germs, and Steels, another great book. Marx, of course. We're going to talk a little bit later. Terry Eagleton and Jonathan Culler's books are very good on the literary background. Terry Eagleton, I used to know him. He's now lost his mind, but he used to be very good. If you go to YouTube, he's made this insane lecture at Yale, kind of attacking Dawkins, and I don't know what's happened to him. And de Saint-Croix is my teacher, and I'm going to talk about him, his great magnum opus, The Class Struggle in the Ancient Greek World, and I'll read you some choice passages. De Saint-Croix, as I'll just say briefly, was a fierce atheist. He was the one I first confronted as the greatest atheist I'd ever met. And I was still kind of toying with Christianity as bells and smells and cute altar boys and pretty pictures. But he was the one who made me, and who used to give annual lectures against the Christians in Oxford, which were great fun. We might talk about that. All right, contested binaries. Very important. Memes versus race and DNA. When I speak of the Greeks or the Jews or the Israelites, I am not referring to a physical people so much as the set of memes. Do you all know that word memes from Dawkins and Dennett? It comes from the word memory. And Dawkins, I think it was in The Selfish Gene originally, back in 72 or something, came up with this quite brilliant idea that just as there are genetic genes that pass on knowledge to us physically, that there are cultural genes, and he called them memes. Something like the nude or pants are a meme. The idea that you're not wearing a toga today, that you got up and put on pants, is a meme. You had to be culturally taught to do that. Okay? And almost everything we do is filtered through memes. Which came to be assembled and function under the names Hellenism and Judaism. I am not promoting or denigrating any people as superior or inferior to other real people, but critiquing the memes of functioning sets. Is that clear? So I'm not saying the Greeks are good guys, the Jews are bad guys, or vice versa, or anything like that. Okay? Now, another binary, sex and sexuality versus gender. I know you all thought you were born little boys and girls. You weren't. All right? You were born, now this is Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. You were probably born with an anatomical sex. Although extreme constructionists even fight about that. I'm not that camp. I'm a very moderate constructionist. I believe there is anatomical sex that you were born with, when you look at yourself in the morning. And however, what is radical is that the constructionists like Judith Butler, Foucault, have strongly argued that over that outlay there is gender, and gender is a construct. It's an ideological construct. All of us have learned to be boy or girl, and none of us performs that perfectly. All of us every day are acting out gender roles. This is quite a revolution, which has really only happened in the last 30 years since Foucault invented the history of sexuality, although there might have been forerunners. But really, this has become a whole thing the last 30 years. Okay, that'll come up as we go along. Monotheism was coined by a Cambridge Platonist named Henry Moore. The Cambridge Platonists, we're not going to talk about now, but they're an interesting group of people. Milton, incidentally, was there with him. And that's where the word monotheism means one God. You believe in one God. All right, we're going a little faster now. A little background here, just to make sure we're all on the same page, some words. A nice word to use is henotheism. How many of you know henotheism? That's much rarer. It was coined by Max Müller up there, who was a German professor at Oxford. Very important in the whole development of the scholarship on religions in the 19th century. He was a very eminent scholar. And he coined the word. It means the belief in one God, but not to the exclusion of other gods. And in fact, monotheism is actually quite rare in history. In fact, probably was invented in America in the 1950s. But in fact, when you really look at Judaism, etc., they really are forms of henotheism, even Christianity. All right, they don't deny there are demons, and even Satan. Some Christians believe Satan is the other form of God. Monolatry is another thing like that. Incidentally, any of you are interested in music, Max Müller's father, Wilhelm, was a German poet friendly with Franz Schubert, and it was his poetry that Franz Schubert set to music in Die Winterreise and Die Schöne Müllerin, those two famous song cycles. Monolatry is kind of similar to henotheism and cathotheism. I'm not going to worry about right now. All right, you need that more for Hinduism. All right, so far as we can tell, monotheism, or something like it, possibly henotheism, was invented by this extraordinarily interesting person, Akhenaten, and his wife Nefertiti. How many have heard of Akhenaten and Nefertiti? All right, some. Incidentally, her name, Nefer, whenever you see names in Egyptian with Nefer, it means beautiful. And beautiful, her name is very beautiful. It means the one who walks in beauty, or the one who comes in beauty. All right? Akhenaten's name means the one who's in touch with the Aten, sort of. Now, something happened. This is way beyond what we're going to talk about today. For some reason, at the height of the Egyptian Empire, his father was probably the greatest of all the pharaohs, Amenhotep III. The Egyptian Empire spreads from the Euphrates down into Africa, Libya, this vast empire. For some reason, when he becomes pharaoh, he decides to close all the temples to the gods in the 5th year of his reign. He closed all the priesthoods, etc., and starts a new religion, or takes one part, the sun god, and decides he's the guy, a henotheism. That's him worshiping. And he's a religious genius. He invents a symbol, the Aten disk. There he is worshiping the Aten. He is also the world's first pacifist. We know this because, that's his beautiful wife, Nefertiti, is famous. Everybody's seen this, right? The original is in Berlin. They want it back now, the Egyptians. I don't think they should get it. They're not ready for it. But anyway, it's better in Berlin. They conserve it very well. And this stunning, this was found in 1913, this beautiful, beautiful statue. Now notice he's quite misshapen. Medical experts fight about what disease he had. I remember I used to hear, I'm not a doctor, but I think one thing they used to say was Hodgkin's. But then the problem is he's not supposed to be able to have children. That's supposed to make you sterile. And we know he had at least 6 children, including possibly Tutankhamun and daughters, etc. But he had these very strange hips. There's been a lot of speculation whether he came to think of himself as a woman, and we're not going to go there. All right, so there he is. Now, what's interesting about his pacifism, he refused to let the Egyptian armies fight. And this caused an enormous crisis for the empire. Oh, I'm missing slides. Oh, okay. Now, Freud comes along, and in Moses and Monotheism, he gets the brilliant idea that it was the Hebrews are the remnant of Akhenaten's Aten religion. Because when he died after 17 or 18 years of reign, the priests finally got back control. There was chaos. The priests got control back and eventually put the 9-year-old boy Tutankhamun on the throne, who died at 18 or 19. And they then reopened the temples and erased his name all over Egypt. All right? And he was given what the Romans called a damnatio memoriae, a damnation of his memory. In fact, we knew nothing about him until 1891, as you're going to see. I thought I had, but I do miss a slide. I had a slide. I'm missing a slide. Oh, the Amarna letters. That's the correspondence that he had with all the vassals in the Middle East, etc., which tells us that he was a pacifist. And they were desperate. They were sending him notes. Please send the Egyptian army to defend us. And his letters back, no, the Aten disk is the one who loves us. He's we are brothers. All right, he was like Gandhi or something, a very extraordinary person. Anyway, he was completely forgotten until the archaeologists recovered this all. All right, we're moving ahead. Freud came up with the brilliant idea, I just want to go back here to Habiru. The first time we see this word in Egyptian, Habiru, is in the letters of Akhenaten. And they seem to be a people living in Egypt, and the Egyptologists way back when they were first discovered said, Habiru, that's Hebrews. All right? And this fight is still going on within the Egyptologist community, whether it is the Hebrews or not, and whoever they are. But that's, Freud then said that the Aten disk was the origin of the thing. Now, we get to the adoration of the golden calf. These are all myths, and I don't think any of this is really historical. This is by Poussin, this great painting in the National Gallery, London. Now, we all know the story when Moses was up on the mountain. As the Bible says, the Jews backslid. They went into backsliding, which sounded like fun to me. And they were worshiping the golden calf, who was the goddess Hathor, the goddess of sexuality, love, fertility. Moses comes down, bashes and he's got laws now for the first time. And he says, no, you're not supposed to do this, bad boys and girls. And that night, quite appalling, he and his boys go through the crowd and kill 3,000 of the Israelites because they were having a party. Now, this is like you would go into New York, into the discotheques, and in the morning as everybody was coming out, you started to kill them because they had a good time the night before. All right? It's loony. But this is what monotheism begins to do. It begins to say there's a set of laws, and you better control the body and stop worshiping all those fertility sex gods. It also, we now know, in fact, it's more and more likely that Judaism was polytheistic until the exile. Really, what we think of as Judaism is what we call a post-exilic creation. That David and Solomon, etc., if they existed at all, were probably still polytheistic. And we know that Yahweh, the war god that we call Jehovah, had a wife, Asherot. All right, that's now been recovered. Now, yes. Now, that's Van Dyck's beautiful picture of the brass serpents. Two things I'm just going to quickly go over that's causing a huge stir in Old Testament studies. These two people in particular, Keith Whitelum in The Invention of Ancient Israel and Thomas Thompson, The Mythic Past, Biblical Archaeology and the Myth of Israel, have basically shown that virtually all of the Old Testament stories are essentially fiction. All right? This is driving the Old Testament archaeologists up 10 walls. All right? Because they really can't answer it. What I find is when I go to meetings, they just haven't even read it. They just say, oh, them? They don't believe anything. And so, if you want, you can explore that. Now, some important things. With the invention of monotheism, we get the creation of the heretic and the other. As soon as you say, I got the right God, everything you are worshiping is the wrong God. And therefore, I have the right to do nasty things to you. Like kill you, get rid of you, call you a heretic, call you an infidel, call you the Taliban, call you whatever. We start naming people as the other. Okay? Now, this is important. In polytheism, the worship of many gods is not doctrinal, all right, but about the performance of cult for the gods. No one would have asked you in ancient Greece what you thought about Zeus or whether you loved Zeus. The only important thing was that the state cults for the gods were performed so that the gods got their sacrifices and stayed out of your way and did what you wanted. But nobody wrote theology books about the gods. This becomes an obsession of Christianity, as we're going to see. It's very hard for moderns to understand this because we're constantly hit by people, do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in Jehovah? Do you believe in this? Nobody talked about belief. It was cult. All right? There is no discussion of faith or correct belief in polytheism. Okay? Or even atheism meant you had refused to perform state cults to the gods. Nobody asked you whether they believed in them or not. Is that clear? If there's any burning question, you could, am I being okay? Sodom and Gomorrah. This is definitely monotheism. If there was one story I would tear out of the Bible, it's that. It has probably resulted in the deaths of at least hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people over the last 2+ millennia. If you want to read Lewis Crompton's great book, Homosexuality and Civilization, is an astonishing record of civilization. And in the last chapter, after he writes this amazingly erudite 900-page book, which I just finished last year, and I learned more about sex than I ever thought I knew. But in the end, in the final chapter, he has a chapter on China, Japan, the Arabs, and he says in the end, he said, I don't really want to be nasty about the Judeo-Christian stuff, but there is no other civilization or culture that has so demonized sex in the body like the Judeo-Christian religion, especially the Christian part. All right? It's a unique hatred of sex in the body, which you do not really find anywhere else. And it's certainly not in this form. Michael Rock's incredible book, Forbidden Friendships, I'll talk about when we get to the Renaissance, Homosexuality and Male Culture. Mark Jordan, The Invention of Sodomy in Christian Theology. You know, we always hear every day in the paper, sodomy this, sodomy that, someone's accused of sodomy, someone's arrested for sodomy. Sodomy was an invention of Christianity. No one before Christianity was penalized. There was no, first of all, the word didn't exist. It had to come from the Jewish story in the Old Testament. The Greeks and Romans, they knew about sex, plenty. But nobody was ever arrested for sexual acts except rape. That was a crime of violence. All right? Now, you were not free to go around doing anything you wanted. There were parameters. But no one was put on trial, etc., for crimes of sex. Sexuality was decriminalized. All right? Essentially. And so that's what I say there. Now, you know, I don't understand people like Mark Jordan. He's a Catholic priest. He's gay. He was thrown out of Notre Dame for writing that book, he says in the introduction, but apparently still clinging. You know, so many people like that. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know. Just get out. I don't know. All right, now we're going to a breath of fresh air. We're getting out of that ideological mess. We're going to the fresh air of the Greeks. Here we have this beautiful red-figured Greek vase. Priam approaches Achilles, imploring him to return the body of his son Hector. How many of you have read the Iliad? Know something about the Iliad? Now, whenever I'm teaching the Greek stuff, the Iliad, it's just overwhelming, the difference in the two worlds you've come to. In the Old Testament world, maybe I'll read this now, just before we get to the Greeks. This is my teacher de Saint-Croix, in this extraordinary thing he says. He says, I do not wish to give the impression that the Romans were habitually the most cruel and ruthless of all ancient imperial powers. Which nation in antiquity has the best claim to that title I cannot say, as I do not know all the evidence. He's lying, he did. On the basis of such of the evidence as I do know, however, I can say that I know only one people which felt able to assert that it actually had a divine command to exterminate whole populations among those it conquered, namely Israel. Nowadays, Christians as well as Jews seldom care to dwell upon the merciless ferocity of Yahweh, as revealed not by hostile sources, but by the very literature they themselves regard as sacred. Indeed, they contrive as a rule to forget the very existence of the incriminating material. I feel I should mention, therefore, that there is little in pagan literature quite as morally revolting as the stories of the massacres allegedly carried out at Jericho, etc. Then he talks about the Gibeonites, how this text was used. The Gibeonites are shown as escaping total destruction by Israel only because they had previously deceived Joshua and the leading Israelites into making a sworn treaty to spare their lives by pretending they had come from afar. Their fate was to be perpetual servants of the Israelites, their hewers of wood and drawers of water in perpetuity. Text often quoted today, when the book was written, as scriptural justification for apartheid. And finally, the Romans, although refusing, like so many Greek cities, to recognize unions between their own citizens and foreigners, lawful marriages to foreigners, showed nothing like the ferocious hatred of such unions which we find in another revolting Old Testament story, that of Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, who was up there. He kills Simri, the Israelite, and his Midianite wife, Cosbri, spearing the woman through the belly, and thereby earns the warm approval of Yahweh and the cessation of a plague that Yahweh had sent on them that had killed 24,000 over the marriage. Now, none of this is true, presumably, but the fact that they think it's true is pretty wild. Now, what's striking about the world of Homer and the Greeks ever afterwards, you cannot tell who are the good guys and the bad guys in the Trojan War. Everybody is absolutely morally validated as human beings. And one of the most striking things in page after page, when Achilles or one of the warriors goes up to another warrior, even if they're going to kill each other, they immediately ask, but who are you? Who was your father? Who was your grandfather? Now, this is literary, but, this didn't happen in real battle, but still that Homer has to put this in. And there's a very moving story in Book 21 when he meets the young boy Lachaon, who he had just previously captured and sold into slavery. The boy has been ransomed and back in the battlefield, and he falls at Achilles' feet. And he begs him not to kill him, that his father will ransom him again, King Priam. And Achilles looks down and he says, "You are only a boy, Lachaon, but I must kill you, as I too must die, because this is the fate of men in battle." But he is utterly humanized. Note, when Jason and Yahweh are killing people, it's because they're infidels in the other. They are not seen as human. And of course, we could go on with this. Now here, in this extraordinary scene, Achilles is furious. If you remember, he's killed Priam's greatest son, Hector. Hector's body has been rotting for 10 days, and Priam sneaks into the tent at night in this incredible scene. He puts his hand into the hand that has killed so many of his sons. And Achilles is playing the lyre, mourning for his friend Patroclus. And he looks down and he sees the king whom they're fighting. And he begins to weep. And they embrace each other. And he says, "Come, take your son and go back to the city before the sun rises, because we must start the war again." So there's this total humanizing of the other. All right, we're going to move fast. We're going to talk about Harmodius and Aristogeiton. You did not know that democracy started in a gay love story. It wasn't in your world history textbook? I can't believe that. All right. Now, Harmodius and Aristogeiton were involved in a triangle. They were what we call pederastic lovers. Incidentally, there's a big debate whether we should even call what was going on in Greece homosexuality. Homosexuality seems to imply in the modern world people of equal age, equal status. Through most of history, pederasty has been the norm. It's usually intergenerational, an olderish man falling in love with a younger boy, in a sense, initiation into the society. This was very much the pattern in Greece, in Arabia, in India, China, etc. Anyway, the story, which we're not going to go into too much, the tyrant of Athens fell in love with Harmodius, the younger boy. He was insulted. They started a plot. They overthrew it. Now, what's odd, this is 514 BC, the Greeks took this and looked on it as the founding moment of their democracy. They romanticized and made this the focus of their whole society. They set up the first statue to mortals in their public space, the Agora. Two very famous statues. All private and state functions began with prayers and sacrifice to the two lovers. Drinking songs, scholia, was sung at the beginning of every party or symposium in their honor. Before the party would start, you would pour wine to the spirits of the dead lovers, because they had founded the democracy. And what is so difficult for Americans to understand is that for the Greeks, the polis was the city of love. The polis is Eros. The chief god that you would worship in the gymnasium, the city, and war, aside from Athena or whatever goddess or god was the patron, was Eros. On the great state occasions, all men and boys came with their lovers to the graves of the tyrannicides, and they would swear loyalty to the polis, to their democracy and the gods, and recited the Ephebic Oath. How many of you know the Ephebic Oath? Where each of them would hold hands and they would say at the end of it, "We will transmit this city not only less, but greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us." Very beautiful statement. When the statues were stolen by the Persians, Alexander the Great returned them to the Greeks when he came into power. This is a beautiful coin with the statues in place from the 5th century. Incidentally, just a little bit about politics, which is so hard. There are no functioning democracies in the world now, in the eyes of the Greeks. All current forms of organization are oligarchies, plutocracies, and worse. One of the main things what you learn from Aristotle's Politics, etc., is elections were looked upon as a tool of oligarchies and plutocracies to control who ruled, as they still are. The real feature of democracies was the lottery. And this drove oligarchs and plutocrats wild. Because in every Greek city where there was a democracy, most of the offices on the low level were filled by lot. So the oligarchs and the people in power, like Bloomberg just won his election by buying it, and it's just a common rule in America, you buy elections, etc. That was impossible because everything was by lottery. And there were two reasons for that. First, to give everybody the experience of ruling and being ruled, and to know how the machinery of the state worked. All right? There were elections, but for only high offices and things, so that's pretty interesting, I think. All right, now, Aeschylus. How did this affect theater? Right after the 9/11 attacks, Tony Randall had a performance down here at Pace University of the oldest surviving play in world literature, The Persians. Remarkable play. It was one of the most stunning performances I've ever been to in my life. When the whole country was going on about the other, the Arabs, the Islamic fascists, the this, the other, Tony Randall said, look at what the Greeks did. 8 years after the Persians had invaded Athens and burned the temples, in the great theater, the world's first known playwright, Aeschylus, the equal of Shakespeare in most people's opinion, and we only have 7 of his 90 plays. He wrote this play in which it's set in Persia, and it's the terrible tragedy from the eyes of the Persians they've just suffered by being defeated by the Persians. It's as though somebody, some modern playwright, Tony Kushner or something, was to put on a play on Broadway, or more like in the Kennedy Center, in which all of Congress came, in which Osama bin Laden or something was actually humanized as a real person with real moral, intellectual conflicts, and not demonized as simply the other, the most wanted. All right? Now, you have to realize, incidentally, that's, a lot of this we get from Potts and things, but I can't go into that. This is where all the world's first plays were performed, on the south slope of the Acropolis, the great theater of Dionysus, which was there from around 535 BC. It seated about 14,000 to 17,000 people. Basically, the whole state came out for the great festivals of the plays. So you're realizing that the whole Athenian population is sitting there listening to this play in which the queen and Xerxes are talking about the tragedy and the generals and the friends they've lost, and above them the Athenians could look up, just as we could have looked up at 9/11, and seen the burned temples that the Persians had just done 8 years before. And yet Aeschylus is saying, but they're human. All right? Even though we might fight them, they're our enemies, they too are no different. That's an extraordinary, imaginative, moral, and it's almost unique in world history. Very few people are capable of that. This is the best preserved of all the Greek theaters, the great theater of Epidaurus. It was also a great medical sanctuary where there were cures. It was kind of like Lourdes or something, but more high class. It was upmarket Lourdes, with real science of the day. All right, now the other thing, the invention of the Greeks besides the theater, is the gymnasium. Not just your tennis, New York tennis racket court or stuff. Anybody know what gymnasium means? Gymnos means naked. It's the naked space, the naked room. Why? Because all athletics and sports was performed naked for the Greeks. The Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, all the Pan-Hellenic Games, everything was naked. All right, we can't, it's great for me if they bring that back, but I don't think it's going to happen. All right? Not soon anyway in America or anywhere. Now, this is we have this beautiful gymnasium from Pompeii, which was buried in 79 AD. Now, for the Greeks, the gymnasium was not a diversion. It was the place where women probably had their own, although we know far less about that, where they became citizens under the gaze of other men. We also remember that all the great philosophical schools of Plato, Aristotle, etc., were taking place in the gymnasiums. All right? So all day long you would sit and watch the naked men and boys while you were talking about philosophy. This was not an accident of the Greeks, because for the Greeks, the greatest thing you could do for the gods is be like them. And the gods were beautiful and wise. And if you were beautiful and wise and athletic, you were like the gods. And that's how you honored them. The Greek word pais or paides means boy or child. What you did to them, raising them, was called paideia, from which we get the word encyclopaideia, encyclopedia. The encircling of knowledge comes from the Greek word for child. Now, let's get heavy here. This is one of the few surviving original Greek masterpieces from the 4th century. It was found buried under a volcanic eruption. It's the famous statue of Hermes with the infant Dionysus by Praxiteles. We know that because the ancient guidebook to the area by Pausanias, thank goodness for Pausanias that we have Pausanias, so that when we find these things we can read our Pausanias, and that's where it was. So we found it, so we're pretty reasonably certain that is it, the great statue of Praxiteles from 330 BC. Naked. All of the Greek statues would have been painted. All right, no Greek statues were left unpainted. We think they were because very little of the paint is ever left. And eyes would have been either painted or put in glasses, we'll see. Comes from gymnos, so it's the naked room. All athletics were performed in the nude. You could read the great book, Ton Scanlon's Eros in Greek Athletics, how sexuality and athletics really were very interwoven. The Greeks invent the meme of the nude, which is not the naked. The nude is a cultural, ideological, and aesthetic molding and presentation of the body. All nudes in art derive ultimately from the ancient Greeks. Any place that Greek art has not infiltrated, we don't get nudes. You might get naked, like in Mayan art, but they're not stylized. They're not attempts to create aesthetically a stylized cultural artifact. Unfortunately, this is a little dark. This is a treasure, really. This was found in 1925 in the sea in the Bay of Naples. One of the very, very few original Greek bronzes. Anybody know why we don't find many bronze statues? They were melted down. At some point, a bronze statue, when a war comes around, you melt it down for weapons or coinage or something. So very few survive. Almost all of them that we have found were either buried in volcanic eruptions or from the ocean. This extraordinary statue is a young ephebe, possibly by Praxiteles also. You might want to read Andrew Stewart's Art, Desire, and the Body in Ancient Greek, the body as ideology. This statue is not nudity, it's an ideological statement about what a young man is supposed to be, how he's supposed to look, and how he's supposed to function in Greek society as both an object of desire and as a potential friend, citizen, and warrior. Everything he is doing, I could give a whole seminar on that statue, what he's doing, how he's standing, what it means. Everything means something, all right? That would have been originally painted. If it was a little lighter, you could see his glass eyes. Notice we're going to talk about his contrapunto, where you have one leg. That was invented by Polyclitus. It becomes a meme in Western art. Even in Hindu art, the Hindus get it when Alexander the Great conquers northern India. So we see it a lot in Hindu statues, Indian statues. It's called the line of beauty, that contrapposto. In the 18th century, Hogarth writes a book on it, and actually very important in Bach and 18th century music theory. They took this extremely serious. I mean, one of the courses I took up at Juilliard when I'm studying now, my professor just put the first fugue, the first prelude of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier on the board, and he showed how the whole thing followed what we call the Pythagorean canon, which is the line of beauty. Bach did not do this by accident. This is a copy of the first nude female statue known in the world, also by Praxiteles. It was a statue of Aphrodite of Kninos. The famous legend is that the island of Kos asked Aphrodite to make a statue of the goddess Aphrodite, and when he made it nude, they were shocked and wouldn't buy it, so the nearby town of Knidos bought it, and it became one of the most famous statues of the world, very likely destroyed by the Christians, as we'll see later on. These are copies. This is a famous head in the Louvre, the Kaufmann head. This is the Lodovici Aphrodite of Knidos, which is in Rome now, I think, in the collections. Supposedly the story is that his courtesan Phryne, one of his girlfriends, posed for it, and the story is that he had a nightmare one night, and Aphrodite came to him and said, Praxiteles, where did you see me naked to make me like that? All right. So he then puts. Incidentally, in New York, where do we have a copy of this out in public? In front of the Plaza Hotel, on top of the fountain. It's called the Venus Pudica, because she's holding herself modestly with her hand in front. It's called the Venus Pudica. There's a statue on the fountain. Next time go by, look at it. It's all around you. Now, this is very interesting. Are you all surviving? Is this intelligible? Yes? Making some sense? Yes, okay, all right. This is very, very interesting. My doctoral dissertation was, I didn't finish it, but it was going to be on sexuality in ancient Greece. So well, I know something about this. All right, Aeschines is particularly interesting because one of the things we've learned to do, we have quite a body of what we call the Greek orators have survived. That was basically trials, or a lot of it was trials. What we've learned to do is read it as sociology. And this man, Sir Kenneth Dover, a very great Greek scholar, he wrote a book called Popular Culture in Ancient Greece, and he made a very interesting observation. He said, you know, whatever you can say to a jury must be something that is commonly accepted values and mores of that society, or you wouldn't be able to say it to the jury. All right? You know, you can't tell the jury anything that they're going to be up in hackles about. All right? Now, this famous trial against Timarchus was first used by Foucault in his essay on a boy's honor. Timarchus was on trial for losing his citizenship on the claim that he had prostituted his body as a boy. He was apparently very beautiful. Now, in ancient Athens, everybody, let me go backtrack. Aeschines comes before the jury and he says something that is unimaginable in the modern world. He says to the jury, you know, all of you men on this jury have your boyfriends. You all, we know, have been involved in love affairs. I myself am notorious, all right, in the gymnasium. Now, you could not say that to a modern jury. I don't think. All right. So what these people are saying is, hold it, this must tell us something very profound about what was normal in ancient Greece. All of these men were married. All right? There was no conflict between marriage and sexuality, really. You had your wife and your children, but your boyfriends, your lovers, were in the palaestra, the gymnasium, the theater. All right? And you carried on both lives. All right? And he reads love letters. And he says, we're not putting Timarchus on trial because he was having sex with men, but because as a citizen, he was not allowed to sell his body. It's not sex that's bad, it's the selling of it and making yourself a prostitute. And he lost his citizenship. It's a very famous trial. You know, when I was studying all this stuff way back in the 60s, etc., at Hunter College, etc., it was amazing the text I was using in Greek and Latin. Most of them had been written in the 19th century. And whenever we would get to a passage about sex, they would either blot it out, or they would do silly things like translate it into Italian or German, as though if you could read it in Italian or German, it was okay. And it was amazing how bowdlerized texts were, and nobody talked about it. All right, until Dover wrote his first great book, Greek Homosexuality, and broke the ice. Famous preface, he says, I'm a married man, apparently essentially straight, but nothing sexual horrifies me. And it's about time we started talking about this fundamental feature of Western civilization, sexuality. And it was Halperin, another great thing. Anybody know when the word homosexual and bisexual was invented? They're not old. 1869, by an Austrian named Kurt Benny. You can read that in the first essay, 100 Years of Homosexuality by David Halperin. And they were coined as back formations. I'll mention that in a minute. Now another way we know what Greek audiences, what their values were. Everybody know who Aristophanes is? The great comic playwright. There's a hilarious, every scene is very funny and very full. You have no idea how sexual these plays are. Even in translation, they have to leave a lot of it out, because it's so graphic in the Greek. I mean, and what's odd is you have these passages of unbelievable poetic beauty, and then the most pornographic graphic descriptions going on the stage. Incidentally, you have to remember in Greek comedy, all the actors came out with massive phalloi as costumes, big penises, padded penises. And part of the play, they would go into the audience and hit them, and it was very much wild, pretty wild. So, and what's this interesting passage? Aristophanes' joke, he says, well, you know, you've all been in the gymnasium when the boys are sitting around listening to a lesson, they're all naked, and when they get up in the sand, their buttocks have left impressions. And you know how all their lovers go over to the sand and start looking at the marks in the sand of the boys' buttocks and fighting over who has the nicest one. All right? Now, you couldn't say that in a modern stage. I mean, you couldn't say to an American audience, oh, you're all doing that in the gym, aren't you? In fact, I can't tell you what's happened to the gym. I mean, I go to my local gym. I don't want to go there right now, but I tell you about it. It's astonishing how terrified young college men are of their bodies now. It has never been in my lifetime. They sit there with towels. They don't want to. It's just unbelievable. The display of the body terrifies them. And these are mostly all immigrants. You know, so you can't even say they're Americans. It's a sea change in my experience. Now, this is all going to come together. We're getting the Jews and the Greeks meeting in this. There's a beautiful, incidentally, the Greeks have made the most beautiful coins ever. They're just astonishing works of aesthetics. This is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He has a big blowout. He's ruler. He has the empire after Alexander dies, and he's in control of what is Israel, Palestine, Jerusalem. The Greeks freaked out over circumcision. They regarded it like genital mutilation. You know, the way we talk about female circumcision as genital mutilation. The Greeks regarded circumcision that way. They were quite horrified by it. And on top of it, what really upset the religious Jews in Jerusalem and Israel was that Antiochus built gymnasia where naked men and boys performed. He built theaters, and this caused the Maccabean revolt. It is the first time where we get the clash between Hebraism and Hellenism, which is going to be with us till today. All right? Where we get one part of the population horrified by sexuality and display of the secular part. Actually, it goes on very much in Israel, I understand, between Haifa and Jerusalem. There was just a thing on NPR the other day about how there's this really intense hatred between the religious communities of Jerusalem and the highly secularized communities of Tel Aviv, you know, where they're partying all night. So, you know, this goes back at least to Antiochus. Now, we're moving ahead. We're not doing a whole history of civilization here, although it may sound like that. All right, we get to one of the great, as Jeffrey Dusonquois used to say, I remember he came out as a tutorial once and he said, I wanted to tease him, so on the top of my essay, it was the Feast of the Conversion of St. Paul, I think January 28th. So I just put it on there to get Jeffrey's ire up. So he comes out of the back room and he says, you know, he said, St. Paul is one of the great enemies of mankind. I mean, maybe the greatest. And he said, you know, one of the worst passages in the Acts of the Apostles is when there's that storm at sea and St. Paul is on board. And you're just hoping the ship goes down. And they pray to their gods, and that stupid captain makes the decision to throw the cargo overboard and save Paul. One of the great turning points of history. Now, Caravaggio's great picture in Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. What does he do? Paul, very fundamentally, is not a native Israelite. He's bicultural, bilingual, possibly bisexual, many people think, but we don't know. What really makes him able to transfer Judaism is he's not a native Jew. He speaks Greek and he had some Greek education. And therefore, he's going to transfer Judaism from a tribal cult into a Greek-style religion. What he's going to do is he's going to take this cult of the dying Messiah and translate him into the language of the Hellenistic dying gods, Dionysus, Athos, Osiris, the gods who rise and are resurrected. Jeffrey makes a brilliant remark in here from a viewpoint of materialist understanding. Makes a stunning, that one sentence people would kill for if they had thought of it. He says what Paul really did was transfer the ideological perspective of a Jewish Palestinian peasant, and he has a brilliant excursus on how far as we can tell, Jesus always avoids going into Greek cities. Whenever there's a Greek city or a village on his way, he goes around it and stays in the Jewish countryside. And he said the genius, if you want to call it that, of Paul is to translate that Palestinian country view into the international world of the Greek Hellenistic mind and cities. Stunning observation. Okay. Incidentally, the best place to learn about Christianity is Bart Ehrman's books now. It's a really good, he's a stunning scholar. He has tapes and all his books. He's at Chapel Hill. He's head of the religious department. He's a very, very fine scholar. All right, now this is really extraordinary. This was up at the Metropolitan Museum for a few months. The Met unfortunately did not buy it. By an act of the Satan, it is now in Texas forever. Nothing. You know, I'm not really an American, I'm a New Yorker. All right. Everything west of the Hudson frightens me. Sorry. There may be foreigners here, I know. I forgive you. Anyway, we could have had this here in the Met, and the Met blew it. Anyway, they did show it here. This is the first, apparently the first painting Michelangelo ever did at roughly the age of 13 or 14. They were conserving it. Now, look at this. Look at this, and then let's go back. Yep. Oh, how do I go back, Nick?
Yeah, there you go. To the left.
To the left? How do I go back? Mind the pictures we had of Praxiteles' nudes, where the body is conceived as healthy, athletic, normal. This is what Christianity does. All right? We are in another world where the body is the site of vermin, sickness, temptation, dirt, everything to be avoided so that we get the reward in some future, cloud where we're sitting hymning God. Now, look at this. This is one of the most important people in Western history you've never heard of, St. Anthony the Great of the Desert. He was basically a crazy, he was a lunatic. But he lived for 30 or 40 years in a cave in the Egyptian desert. And now, if you had said this to Plato or some guy in the gymnasium, they'd be like, this guy's nuts. Nobody in their right mind goes and lives in a cave and thinks that he's doing something virtuous, covering himself with lice, thinking demons and Satan is tempting him with women, and this is a whole new ball game. All right? St. Anthony. All right? Wish he had never existed, but he did. Pachomius comes around. Now, he attracts quite a attention. He's like a medicine man. So other guys start to find their own caves around his cave. It becomes quite popular. I don't know if the rents were high, but each guy found his cave. Now, one of them gets the bright idea, gee, maybe we should have a meal in common. It's getting a little lonely in the cave after 20, 30 years here, no television, no sauna, a little boring. No books, just fighting with the devils and the demons that I'm getting sent every day. All right, so they found what we call cenobitic. Nice terms to try out at your next cocktail party. Ask anybody what they know about eremitic versus cenobitic monasticism. You won't get another invitation, but I'm used to that. All right. Eremitic monasticism means when you actually live on your own, like St. Anthony, in your own cave. You're not a social animal. That got a little boring, so they invented, especially St. Benedict of Nursia in Italy. Italians were a little saintly, they like parties and wine. They decided to found cenobitic monasticism, where you live in more or less a common life, and he founds the Benedictines, which becomes the essential model of Western monasticism, which still has enormous influence on us. Another book you've never heard of, which has an enormous influence on us, St. Athanasius, another horrible person, but anyway, he writes a life of St. Anthony, which for over 15, 16, 17 centuries, people regarded as one of the most important books to read. And what it was a hagiography, a sacred life of St. Anthony's life, and how you too should live a life like that. Now, we have come completely from the public world of the Greeks in the gymnasium, the theater, the polis, public events and celebrations, to this isolated, withdrawn world in which you morbidly think of your body as the site of sin. And how all day long, if you die, the nuns used to tell us, you better get absolution today because if you walk across the street and a car hits you and you haven't been absolved, you'll go to hell. And used to go in a sweat all day long, whether you would, and they'd tell you all these little rituals. Well, before you die, you should just say the Hail Mary and you should say this. And, you tell this to kids, it's poison. It's poison. All right. Now, 2 words here. Everybody know what asceticism is. Asceticism is the denial of the body and its pleasures in the idea that you're having some higher purpose. The way at Lent or something, or Ramadan, you don't eat all day because you're giving it up for your God. It's a sacrifice of the body. The opposite is that's hedonism. That's the pursuit of pleasure as a form of happiness. And we could debate the kinds of pleasures. And that's Michelangelo. All right. Now, none of this would have really mattered. It would have stayed in their caves in the desert. Except this guy comes along, Constantine, known as the Great. This is his famous statue in the Campidoglion in Rome. He becomes the first Christian emperor. We're going to tell you what that happened. His mother, St. Helena, was a barmaid, probably worse, if you want to. But they were all nut jobs. Their family, they murdered themselves left, right, and center. He murdered his son, their brothers, their nephews, their sisters. It was just unbelievable. If you want to read a good popular account, Jonathan Kirsch's God Against the Gods, The History of War Against Monotheism and Polytheism. He's a good journalist, and he's done his homework. It's a good retelling of the story. This is where it happened. None of you probably have seen the Milvian Bridge. I used to sit here and cry sometimes in Rome, thinking it all could have been different. This is the outskirts of Rome. There used to be a nice cafe there. I used to sit and get drunk sometimes, thinking, see if he had only lost that battle. On October 28th in 312, there's a civil war going on, and the young Constantine is having a battle with this guy named Maxentius. Many years later, he tells, what's his name, Caesarea, he'll come to me in a minute, whatever his name was. He tells his biographer, Eusebius of Caesarea, that, before the battle, he looked up in the sun and he saw a cross. And under the cross it said in Greek, en tutoi nika, in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer. Apparently he said to himself, if I win, I will at least honor the Christians. He wins the battle, unfortunately. That was the Tiber, incidentally. This is the wonderful painting in the Vatican by Giulio Romano, who was the pupil of Raphael. A few months later, he publishes one of the most important documents in Western history, the Edict of Milan. All right, what does he say? We have no copy of it. No copy has ever been found, which makes me suspicious. But anyway, we have 2 accounts in Eusebius and Lactantius, two Christians, in which he officially gives tolerance to all religions, but very dramatically starts funding Christianity and preferring it. Now, if you can get a job, and your job as incidentally, there was no priesthood in paganism. There was no fixed clergy. Like we have rabbis and Catholic priests who are for life. They didn't have that in the ancient world. So there was no clergy there, that had a vested interest, all right? But when you start saying, hey, there's a big job over there in that church, if you want to run that church over there, somebody's going to come up and take that job. All right? Well, a lot of people came to take the job. Can I go back, Nick? How do I go back?
Page up.
Page up. Very good. So smart. All right. This is very important and very rarely observed. Every world religion gets spread by getting attached to an empire. Every great religion only becomes a world religion because some empire picks it up as their religion. Zoroastrianism gets attached to the Persian Empire and the Sassanids. Ashoka becomes a Buddhist and perpetrates Buddhism. The Chinese get Taoism and Confucianism. All the world's religion become world religions because they're really political ideologies of a particular empire. This is a stunning coin. If you have it in your basement, you probably could retire. This beautiful gold coin. And why this has so fascinated scholars, numismatists, and scholars of religion is that Constantine has this minted in the same year that he issues the Edict of Milan, saying that he's now, he doesn't say he's a Christian, but people have wondered whether he was sincere. He wasn't baptized until his deathbed. All right? So it always been an issue. Was he sincere? Was he making a political move? Why did he become a Christian? Was he simply clever? And this is a particularly interesting piece of evidence, because on this coin, he's portrayed with the sun god behind him, Sol Invictus, who was his favorite deity before he was a Christian, if he ever became a Christian. Sol Invictus means the unconquered sun. All right, so it's a very interesting piece of evidence. Now, one of my great heroes, Julian, known to the Christians as Julian the Apostate. How many of you know Julian the Apostate? Oh my God. All right, get a statue today on your way home. All right. Julian only ruled for 3 years. He was a nephew of Constantine. He was raised a Christian, but was smart enough to realize this was nonsense. And when he became emperor at 20, he was a very brilliant philosopher already, a great student of Greek. And he begins to say, I'm not a Christian anymore. I'm not going to close the churches yet. Wish he had lived. But he begins to bring back the old religions and tolerates them. All right? If he had lived, we might be living in a different world. Unfortunately, at the age of 23, when he was campaigning against the Persians, he took a sword in the side, a spear, and died in his tent. Apparently his last words, "O Galilean, you have conquered me." We don't know if that's true or not. Gibbon has a beautiful passage on him on how if he had lived, we might be living in a saner world. The last pagan. Oh, Gore Vidal, who we saw in our first slide, he wrote a wonderful historical novel, Julian, which I read years and years and years ago when I was up at Hunter. It's a very positive portrayal of Julian in the world of this world when Christianity is taking over and what it's doing to the world. It's a beautiful book. And many of Julian's own writings quite remarkably survive. I can't believe the Christians didn't burn those. Maybe they were too interesting, or the monks needed something else there, extra on the side after the prayers. Now, another main turning point. Am I boring? Is this okay? Go on? Okay. Another central turning point is Theodosius, known as the Great, or Theodosius I. He does several things which change the world forever. All right? On February 27, 380, he proclaims Trinitarian Nicene Christianity the only allowed legal religion of the whole Roman Empire. All right? That was a stunning proclamation. It is no longer legal to be anything else, on pain of death. All right? He then, in 388, he ordered all the pagan temples closed and outlawed the old Roman religion. All right? You can't sacrifice in them. One of the consequences many of them fall into disuse. Some get taken over as churches. They become quarries, etc. A tremendous artistic catastrophe. All right? In 398, the last Olympic Games are held, the end of the nude guys. They had first been held in 776 BC. That was 1,169 years of the games to the gods. We don't know if there's no evidence that he ended them. He may just simply not funded the next one. In 391, he agreed with Ambrose. This is a very famous story, that there was an altar of victory in the Roman Senate that had been there over 1,000 years as the symbol of the victory of Rome. And Ambrose, who's also a great villain, here he is in Van Dyck's beautiful picture there, holding Dionysius out of the Cathedral of Milan until he agrees to take out the altar of victory. He had a big fight with the last of the pagans over whether that statue of victory should stay in the Roman center, and finally Theodosius sides with Ambrose and orders it taken out. So Rome is definitely gone forever. Very moving. All right. Now here's one of the guys who's enormously... I have a weak spot for St. Jerome, I must say. I have this picture in my bedroom that I look at St. Jerome. He's a fellow here. I don't know. I have sympathy for him. St. Jerome is Cardinal by El Greco, and St. Jerome by Caravaggio. Now you notice what's happened to pictures. You never had a Greek picture or a Chinese picture or a Hindu unless it was Durga, the goddess of death, with skull. All of a sudden, death becomes the focus of your life. And you have no idea that all day long people thought about dying. Life meant nothing. It was your death that validated you and was your goal. Therefore, why wash? Why go to the gym? Why go out and have a nice time? Because, this is meaningless. All right? So St. Jerome has had an enormous, he's a great scholar. He's the first Christian to learn Hebrew. He supposedly beat the rabbi who taught him. And he translates both the Old and the New Testament into Latin, which becomes the official translation of the church for the next 16th, 17th century. He was a very, very brilliant man. Wrote, I often wonder when I see the number of books these guys wrote in their caves and in their little monasteries with no, they were working with quills and soot ink and roaches crawling on their desk, and they just filled bookshelves with books. I guess if you don't have TV and porn and stuff, you get a lot done. All right. Now, St. Jerome, we have his letters, which are absolutely fascinating. One of the most famous is his recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, St. Jerome wakes up in his dream, and he's going up to heaven, and he gets to the pearly gates, and he knocks at the door and opens up. He says, well, here I am, guys, all that suffering in the cave for 20 years and writing the New and the Old Testament and all that stuff. Well, where's my reward? St. Peter said, No, and St. Jerome in his nightmare said, what? What are you talking about? And St. Peter says to him, what's the problem? While you were supposed to be reading the Bible, under the desk you had all the Roman poets, all those dirty stories you were reading, and all that Cicero down below. And in the nightmare, every night in his cave, St. Jerome wakes up screaming that he has not been faithful enough to Christ. Now, this is an extremely, you can't see it, unfortunately, it's a little dark, but I think that it embodies the tension which is totally new in Christian society. Everything is temptation. Notice as St. Jerome is writing there, thinking about his Christian duties, two very erotic little boy angels are standing by looking. No doubt street urchins that were picked up as models. Now clearly, Cavarozzi, whether he meant it or not, clearly those two little boy angels are tempting him sexually in a way. And he's not looking because he's too afraid to look. All right? This is unknown in pre-Christian world. We're in a different space. Oh, this is a maniac. All right. This is what's called St. John Chrysostom. Chrysostom means golden-tongued. He's about as close as you could get to a proto-fascist as happens to be around. He really is crazy. He was a virulent anti-Semite, a virulent homophobe, virulent everything. And he's revered to this day by the Orthodox. And in fact, this statue is from St. Patrick's, a few blocks away. I would go and put a hammer to it, but I can't do that. All right. Now, one of the many things he did, people don't talk about this, is how many Christian mobs there were. We're so focused on the Taliban as destructive. They had nothing on the Christians. One of the many things that St. Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, he led a Christian mob to tear down the greatest of all Greek temples, the temple to Artemis, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They ripped it down, this was where Alexander the Great had been proclaimed the son of Zeus. Now when I visited this, I remember sitting there, and I said, I'm going out to see what's left of it. And I walked out from this little Turkish village I was in, very remote. And I'm walking, and the sun's coming down. I'm walking through these fields, literally frog ponds all around me, frogs croaking. And when I get to the site of the greatest of all Greek temples, one column is standing, which has only been re-erected in modern times. And it's flooded as a frog pond. And this is what they did. I'm going to say something else about that. All right. Oh, this is a fascinating woman. This is Hypatia or Hypatia in Greek. She is one of the, really, it should be in every textbook. She is the first known woman mathematician, a brilliant mathematician. She wrote essays and books on Diophantine equations, on Euclid. Her father was the head of the library at Alexandria, Theon. She was a pagan. Michelangelo put this picture of her in the great picture of the School of Athens in the Stanze di Raffaello in the Vatican. There's a story that when one of the cardinals came by and asked Michelangelo to see the drafts of what he was going to put up there, and he saw this picture of a woman, and he said, "What's a woman doing in there?" And Raphael said, "Well, that's Hypatia, one of the great Platonic philosophers and mathematicians." And supposedly, I don't know how he left her in. Apparently, he left her in that one stupid story that he made it really the nephew of the Pope, but I don't think it looks like a woman. Maybe that was the nephew of the Pope. I don't know. You don't know what they were doing. All right, she's murdered. Hypatia was the daughter of the mathematician Theon, a pagan philosopher she was one of the great lights of the Neoplatonic school. Saint Cyril of Alexandria instigated a mob that literally ripped her to pieces. This 1885 painting is probably her about to be ripped apart. They waylaid her in the street at night and literally tore her apart. All right. One incident, another strange incident, that she was apparently, this whole world is obsessed with virginity, even if it affects pagans. If this story is true, apparently one young man wanted to sleep with her, and she ripped off her menstrual rag and showed it to him and said, "There is nothing at all of beauty in cardinal desires." So we're in a whole new world now, in what we call late antiquity. St. Augustine, he was a Berber or Numidian from North Africa, learned Latin only as his second or third language. I think it was his third. His Confessions, of course, and City of God are enormously influential. Next to St. Paul, he has more influence on us than anybody else. Those really formed the theology of Christianity. He invents the doctrine of original sin. Now remember, this is over 400 years after Jesus. And they're just getting around to invent what we think of in the Christian world as one of the central doctrines of, you were all told when you're Christian, original sin. You have to get baptized because of original sin. Well, for the first 400 years, nobody had heard of it. Until he comes along and invents it, original sin. He invents guilt, predestination, and the famous story, which Bertrand Russell in his chapter on St. Augustine is wonderful. He says, This for a young man to be so obsessed, when he was a young boy, he stole a pear from the neighboring tree. And he goes on and on about why this was the greatest crime, because he wasn't hungry. It was just the thrill of theft. And he just obsessed about this for the rest of his life. Okay, can we move on? Oh, there we go. I like those transitions, they're nice. They told me to do. St. Simeon Stylites. This guy was definitely a basket case, but they're not uncommon. His mother was a nutty Christian, and as a teenager, he decided to become a radical ascetic. In Syria, moved into his cave, moved into the desert, and finally he gets original. He lives on a column, and he becomes quite a tourist site. For the next 39 years, he lived on his column. Nobody knows what he was doing up there. They would occasionally send up postcards. He would write postcards and things. Now, I'll read you this little ditty. Phyllis McGinley, she was a Catholic writer, and she wrote these poems about saints, rather amusing. And I'll read you the one she wrote about Simeon Stylites. 30, page 30. Simeon, they're just humorous little things. On top of a pillar, Simeon sat. He wore no mantle, he had no hat, but bare as a bird sat night and day, and hardly a word did Simeon say. Under the sun of the desert sky, he sat on a pillar 9 feet high. When Fool and his brother came round to admire, he raised it another 9 feet higher. The seasons circled around his head, he lived on water and crusts of bread. And so one hears from Pilgrim's store for 30 years and a little more. And why did Simeon sit like that, without a garment, without a hat, in a holy rage for the world to see? It puzzled the age. It puzzles me. It puzzled many a desert father, and I think it puzzled the good Lord, rather. And now her wonderful poem on St. Jerome, I'll read you, which is delightful. She calls it the Thunderer. God's angry man, his crotchety scholar, was St. Jerome, the great name caller, who cared not a dime for the laws of libel, and in his spare time translated the Bible. Quick to disparage all joys but learning, Jerome thought marriage better than burning, but didn't like women's painted cheeks, didn't like Romans, didn't like Greeks, hated pagans for their pagan ways, but doted on Cicero all his days. A born reformer, cross and gifted, he scolded mankind sterner than Swift did, worked to save the world from the heathen, fled to a cave for peace to breathe in, promptly wherewith for miles around he filled the air with fury and sound. In a mighty prose for almighty ends he thrusted his foes, quarreled with his friends, and served his master, though with complaint. He wasn't a plaster sort of saint, but he swelled men's line with the Christian leaven. It capes all kinds to make a heaven. She's a Catholic, or was a Catholic, but very, very cute little dog. So there's St. Simeon. Let's move ahead. We're going to get, these are like, phew. Jim Baker and Kathy Fay there, you know what you really get with Christianity now is they raise hypocrisy to a new level of art. Since everybody is now living double lives under Christianity and nobody can really talk about who they really are, everybody is a hypocrite. Because nobody's really talking about their real sexual desires, what they really want to do. So hypocrisy becomes the center of all our lives, all right? And that was the Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora. Theodora, you should really read the huge article in Wikipedia on her. I think it's longer than any president. And it's an enormous article. She's just so funny. She was of the lowest of the lows. Various stories. She was her father was a bear keeper. She was certainly a prostitute, and Justinian marries her. Now, what's interesting is we have the historian Procopius, the greatest historian of the age. In all his public books that were printed during their lifetimes, he's full of praise for the emperor and empress. But he wrote a secret history after they died, which is one of the most scurrilous books ever written. On the whole, historians think that's the story. Now, of the many wonderful, wonderful stories I could tell you about Theodora, one of my favorites is she was obsessed with prostitutes. And she hated pimps and passed laws to get them worse and locked up. And at one point, she rounded up a lot of the lowest of the low prostitutes, the so-called 3 obol prostitutes, and sent them off to a convent. Well, the result was, after a few weeks, the girls couldn't take it and started to throw themselves off the cliff. So the message is that being prostitutes, lowest of the low, was actually better than living in the convent. So this is what Christianity was doing for them. My favorite story about her is the 7 orifices. He tells us in there that on her deathbed, as all the monks were praying around her, you know that story of her? The monks were praying around her, and and she opens up her eyes, and supposedly her last words are that she only regret is that the human body has but 7 orifices. Now, one drunk evening in Oxford, we were very far gone, and I proposed that we write a novel called The 8th Orifice, and that each of us be given an orifice to write a novel about. So I don't know whatever happened to that. Justinian, these mosaics are spectacular. They're in Italy, in Ravenna. He is a nut job. In 529, he closes all the schools of the Plato, Aristotle, and prohibits non-Christians from teaching. All right? They all have to leave. Now, we're in the Middle Ages. We're going to move ahead. This is, of course, Chartres. And I don't want you to think that the Christians didn't produce art. My theory is, maybe Freud would say this, that, humans are enormously destructive and we're enormously creative. And Freud, in fact, in Civilization and His Discontents, had the famous discussion of Thanatos versus Eros. Eros being our creative, erotic side, and Thanatos being our death drive. All right? And my feeling is that no matter what is imposed on human beings, even things like Christianity, they will find a way to make it creative. And they do the best they can. I mean, who knows? I'm just off the cuff. That's my theory. This is, of course, one of the greatest of all buildings in Europe. And what's remarkable, it has all the original stained glass at Chartres, 60 miles southeast of Paris. I had a wonderful day there, actually. And we won't go into all of that. We'll skip ahead. Now, actually, art historians would kill for this slide. I was so brilliant when I made it up. Anyway, I came across, this is a very famous part of Chartres. It's the famous portal. Well, the whole, many portals at Chartres. This is one of them. Now notice what's happened from Praxiteles. Where we had the full body as aesthetic object and sexually interesting object, the body disappears. It's as much like a column as possible. In fact, it's better not to have a body. And Oscar Wilde, who we're going to get to, said this, Oscar Wilde is often looked upon as just silly and witty, but almost all his witticisms are extremely profound. This is one of his best. It says, to be really medieval, one should have no body. There. To be really modern, one should have no soul. To be really Greek, one should have no clothes. Now, behind that witticism is a lot of extremely profound insight. She was a tough lady, all right? So one of my favorites, the wife of Bath. Now we're in, air comes back into the universe. This statue is enormously important. It is the first freestanding bronze statue to be cast since the ancient world, so it's technologically extremely important. And it is the first completely nude statue to be made since the ancient world. It is Donatello's great statue of David. And it is highly, highly eroticized. All right? This is no doubt that this is not, we're not in Chartres. That was over 200 years before. Where that's finished. Now, on top of it, nudity has become an ideological challenge to Christian doctrine and asceticism. And just to add a little touch, he puts a flower on the boy's leg, which is seen to be alluding to the boy's allure as a homoerotic object. According to rumors, it was supposed to be one of his many boyfriends. In fact, Vasari tells us in his life that he was a known pederast and that all the young men in his workshop were his boyfriends and lovers, etc. Now, think of that in Robert Mapplethorpe. When we had the Mapplethorpe photos, this was like Mapplethorpe's photographs in 15th century Florence. It was a shot in the eye of the church and their official doctrines. The only difference was, since all the cardinals really didn't believe it, they were buying it up. They said, this is a good thing. We were a little tired of that other stuff. All right? So we're moving on. And what's interesting is, on the top, again, this is in the Met, you can go and visit this, is again, just when Michelangelo made his first painting of St. Anthony, this extraordinary teenager makes what is apparently his first statue, which we now have for 10 years in the Met, in the Spanish patio, the Velez patio. Now, what's interesting, and what my observation of this is, that now we see within the Christian mind a split duality. The same genius that can make the painting of St. Anthony as tormented self makes this incredibly young, erotic Eros, and then is going to go on to make, of course, one of the great icons of Western civilization, his David in Florence. All right? Totally nude. Now, you see, they get away with it by calling it David. You don't call it Giovanni down the street. You call it David and it's okay. All right? So it's a little ruse here. But so what Christianity really gives us is intense internal conflicts between how we view ourselves, which you're going to go on fighting forever. All right, let's move ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, and then we go full-time. Caravaggio puts up this all-time poster of all, this is in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, and again, he gets away with it by either calling it St. John or Isaac, and that was one of his apprentices, and of course, who buys it but Cardinal Del Monte, one of the best-known art collectors in Rome for whom he was working, who had an incredible collection. All right, that's now in the... Now, I told you, I promised you we were going to go beyond any sexuality you had ever heard of or known about. This is it. This is a marvelous, famous, this is in Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, right near this train station. Very little visited. How many times I've sat there, passing in the street in Rome with almost nobody there. A few Germans. That's it. Now, what Bernini does, this is called the ecstasy, or I love this word, transverberation of Santa Teresa of Avila. Now, this is the only known portrayal of orgasm in world art that I know of. What St. Teresa is having is an orgasm. All right? She tells in her autobiography this famous story where she fell down in her convent and she sees this incredibly beautiful young angel comes and repeatedly stabs her in the heart with this flaming arrow of love. And true to her S&M inclinations, she says the pain was intense, but with each stab, the joy got greater. So what her toy closet looked like, I'm not going into. It ain't in the diary. All right, so I'm not going to. Now, what's interesting about this, you could go on giving a whole course in this. Bernini actually puts it in theater. On the side, in the church, are the patrons of the Cornaro Chapel watching St. Teresa in transverberation. All right, so we get this as theater because Renaissance Baroque Rome is theater. All right, the world is theater. If you want to see two explications of this, get Kenneth Clark's Civilization, and Simon Schama's The Power of Art has a whole hour on this, and with beautiful, beautiful photography. I'm a little leery about Simon Schama. He's very middlebrow, and he tries to be so coy and cute. But anyway, it's well worth seeing, well worth seeing. Now, this raises the question, at the same time, Milton is writing Paradise Lost. Do anybody know where the original handwritten copy of Paradise Lost resides? A few blocks from here in the Morgan Library is the great copy of Paradise Lost. Now, if you go online and you type, "Were Milton's angels gay?" you will get a very interesting article making an extremely convincing, in fact, irrefutable case that since all the angels are male, their names are all male, and since they're making whoopee in heaven nonstop, something's going on here. Now, what's interesting, Milton was very, very interesting. He was not an Orthodox Christian. He was really out there. He was an Arian. He was a heterodox. Very, very tormented. Whew. But what's interesting is he really is, in a way, looking ahead. He says, what Freud is going to say is, we're all imprisoned in what Freud called genital sexuality. And what we're all really unhappy about is, for Freud, we're trying to reclaim that infantile sexuality, which Freud called polymorphous perversity, pre-genital pubescent sexuality, in which the whole body was sexualized, not just the erogenous zones. All right? St. Teresa is getting that right now. She's in the transverberation polymorphous perversity. So there are some advantages to being Catholic if you hang in there. But hanging in is hard. If you want to read a fascinating discussion of all this, what's interesting about Milton's angels too is they're not having genital sex. They're commingling their whole essences. So it's really Freud. It's the commingling. I remember when I first read that up at Hunter, I took a course in Milton. I said, these angels are interesting. I said, what are they doing up there? Anyway, my way I'm going to make my fortune, I'm really beyond gay and straight world. I'm going to open up a chain of transverberation bars. We are moving beyond the tired and the old. Polymorphously perverse, transverberating, essence commingling bars. I like that. All right, the Rockby Venus is interesting. Beautiful painting by Velázquez in London. Interestingly, not only Christians dislike this. This statue was hit by an axe by these suffragettes in 1914. Emmeline Pankhurst and Mary Richardson went in with an axe and slashed this painting to pieces. It's been restored somewhat. Anyway, it's still hanging up there. But what's interesting, and when she asked why, she said, well, because they put my friend Emmeline in prison for wanting the vote for women, and also because I'm tired of men looking at women. So it's interesting how, you would have never said that in the Greek world or the polytheistic world. Everybody was looking at everybody. Thank goodness. All right, one of my heroes, Winckelmann, the founder of modern art history. What he does along, now they've had the nude now for 300 or 400 years again. Somebody has to say it's a good thing. In his invention of Greek art, this highly sexed man valorizes Greek sculpture, culture, and civilization, and becomes one of the great influences on the Enlightenment. on Goethe, Hölderlin, the Germans. Everybody read him. Incidentally, how many of you know the film or the book by Thomas Mann, Death in Venice? He's the model for Aschenbach. He's the principal model for von Aschenbach, besides Mann himself. And much of it taken. He's also very, how many of you know The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche? Oh, okay. The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche. Nietzsche, when he writes his famous book in 1870, in which he tries to go beyond the picture of the Greeks as nice statues, quiet. He says, hey, these guys were really having a good time back there. There was a lot of sex, a lot of violence. He changes our image of the Greeks, but he doesn't like democracy. And Winkelmann, he has a fight with Winkelmann in the book. And I think Winkelmann has a pretty good part of the argument there. He valorizes the nude, the erotic, and he's an influence. A great book is The Flesh and the Ideal by Alex Potts. All right, we're moving along here. Oh, he's also almost unknown in America, Friedrich Schiller. He has had probably one of the most influential and good influences on modern thought. In his essays, his letters on the aesthetic education of man in 1794, among the most interesting things in there, he invents the idea of der Spieltrieb, the play drive or instinct. And he says what's really essential, as I was talking about human creativity, that's probably you'd call human creativity, is this intense drive for play. What is play? Disinterested activity with a purpose, to quote Kant. It's coming out of Kant. This is going to have you can't understand Freud, Marx, the whole of kind of what comes after without Schiller. He's not easy to read, unfortunately, so read about him. Johann Huizinga, one of my great heroes, Homo Ludens, man the player. He died in the Nazi death camps. I don't think he was Jewish. I think he was Christian, but they killed him. He was professor of Sanskrit, and he wrote this wonderful book about play. And each chapter is about how one function of our lives, law, education, music, things you don't think about as play, that all of everything in life that's most important is play. Marx is going to come along and say what capitalism and daily life really depresses us about is that there's no play. What we do all day long is something that is not play. We call it work for a wage. And to restore that play time that Schiller says is the essence of our happiness becomes the goal of Marx ultimately, although most people bury that. Okay. Oh, two of my favorites. That's, of course, Gibbon. Gibbon was, he writes The Decline and Fall of History of the Roman Empire, and what's extremely important, of course, it's a masterpiece of prose. He publishes that in 1776, the same year with the Declaration of Independence. This is probably more important. He, in the famous 15th to 18th chapter, for the first time, he says Christianity didn't succeed because of divine intervention. There were real historical reasons for it. And that was like before Darwin, that was one of the most vilified works in European literature. He had to move to Switzerland because it got too hot for him in England. This was, on the other side, my teacher, Geoffrey de St. Croix, who wrote this book, The Class Struggle in the Ancient Greek World, which is a masterpiece of stuff about the Christians, the Jews, and everything. I might read you a little bit about that. That was the only picture I could find of him. Geoffrey died at 90. He was very proud that he had beat the tennis player Fred Perry in 1929 at Wimbledon. And I tell you, he used to keep me hilarious at tutorials. His mother was a Plymouth Brethren. I had never heard of it. I'm sure none of you would know what a Plymouth Brethren were, do you? It was a small cult in England that believed that Joseph of Arimathea had brought the true cross to England and that it was buried next to St. Arthur at Glastonbury. And he said, of course, the consequence was I had to memorize the Bible. My mother read it to me by the hour. So he said, I'm sure my mother in her heart of hearts believed that the Old Testament was originally written in the King James Version. And this was my college, Magdalen. Geoffrey was at New College right across the street. Gibbon was here. This was founded in 1458, and it's just extreme. Our word Magdalen, anybody know the word Magdalen? To be sorry, it comes from the British pronunciation of Magdalene. They pronounce this college Magdalen. Magdalen. There's one at Cambridge, Magdalen with an E at the end. And this is the Great Quad. Erasmus studied here, Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, Gibbon, Edward Gibbon, Oscar Wilde, and of course, C.S. Lewis. To most people in the world, C.S. Lewis, this was his college. There's a dreadful film about him in which it all takes place in this beautiful place. He was a great don of English, but incidentally, my other tutor for Cullen Hardy was C.S. Lewis's closest friend. Along with Tonkin, they founded the Inklings. So I got lots of C.S. Lewis gossip from Cullen Hardy. Very, very interesting stories. And this is the chapel. Every year, A.J.P. Taylor, the famous historian, who was a fierce atheist, used to propose at high table that the chapel be turned into a swimming pool. It's of far more use to the boys. Thank God they didn't tear it down. This is the great Addison's Walk there. Beautiful, beautiful gardens. This is the view outside my window for 2 years. Every morning, every night, I would sit there and look at the deer park was right under me. This extraordinary, except when they used to shoot them to cull them, that used to bother me. And when I used to get very drunk, I used to carry on about how beautiful the deer was to the embarrassment to everyone. Now, one of the other, we're getting near the end. Byron. Byron is one of the great watersheds in the modern world. He eroticizes everything. People don't realize Byron was also, although he was probably one of the two richest men in England, he virtually single-handedly funded the Greek Independence War, died in Greece. His maiden speech in the House of Lords was in support of the strike of the weavers. He was a very fierce, what we would call a socialist defender of the poor, even though he and William Beckford were the richest. William Beckford had to leave because he was notoriously gay and had to live in Portugal, and he was so rich that they had to even let him back into England. And here's, the mock heroic Don Juan, he criticizes everything. He is really the first British rock star. He invents the British rock star. We hear stories that women, men used to follow him down the street to rip off his clothes, like the Beatles or Mick Jagger. Or he invents that whole meme of the British rock star. Why? And my favorite quote, one of his many lovers, Lady Carolyn Lamb, says of him, he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. I would love that on my tombstone, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. That would be such kudos. All right, the Renaissance. All right, when Oscar Wilde comes up to Oxford, he wants to meet two people. One is Walter Pater, and the other is Ruskin. Walter Pater, a great scholar of Greek, a very quiet man. He invents the Renaissance virtually, along with Burckhardt in Switzerland. And in the epilogue, he scandalized. We don't realize how scandalizable Christians are when they really used to make believe they believe this stuff. And even subtle things they would pick up because they were so guilty inside. They knew what every nuance meant because they were thinking about it all day. And in this famous eclogue, one of the most famous sentences in it, at the end of the Renaissance, he says, to burn always with this hard, gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits. Now, what he's praising is hedonism. Not a word about getting your happiness in life from God, any deeper meaning. Art and love are the meaning of life. All right? This was so rapturous to the undergraduates that all the undergraduates at Oxford memorized it and started to read it instead of the Bible. All right? They had to almost threw him out of Oxford. But he was, it takes an act of parliament. Once you're made a don at Oxford, it takes an act of parliament to remove you. So a lot of them did nothing for the rest of their lives. But anyway, we'll move on. We're getting near the end. Now, with this world, we get the return of paganism. We get these both were in the Daesh Museum a few years ago in a wonderful exhibit. Flandrin's wonderful pictures. The nude comes back with a vengeance and highly sexualized art. The invention of photography in 1839. The daguerreotype is going to add more. And then Engels writes The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. One of the great, incidentally, an exhibit you should not miss is the exhibit up at 15 East 84th Street, the new NYU Institute for the Center of Ancient Art on Old Europe. It's an astonishing exhibit, really about the world Engels is talking about, what we call mother right. Engels was using people like Bachofen that argued very brilliantly that there must have been a stage of society preceding patriarchy, male-dominated society, which they call Mutterrecht or matriarchy. That's now pretty, although they still fight about it, Gimburtas, etc. And he argues that it was the takeover of patriarchy that introduces the idea that you better make sure the woman is only having sex with you, because you see, under matriarchy, there's free sex. Everybody in a matriarchy is not worried about who they're having sex with, because there's no private property. Private property, when you get private property, then you worry about having one wife, one girlfriend, and she better only be with you. Because, why? Inheritance. You want to make sure that your male children are yours, not anybody else who got into her bedroom. All right? So the obsession with virginity enters, and the state then becomes the band of patriarchal men who organize themselves around a chief and then start to accumulate surplus. Anyway, it's all in there. Read it with Eleanor I should just say that. Yeah, she was a great woman. Eleanor Burkhart, where'd she go here? She died at 64. She was an anthropologist. She wrote a brilliant introduction to this book, so make sure you read that. And we'll end more or less with Oscar. There's Oscar on the left. And on the right is Audrey Beardsley. Apparently one night they were talking, drinking, and it came up about what good the Christians had done. And Beardsley said, Nero, I should tell you the story. In Suetonius and Tacitus, there's a famous story that Nero, who was deranged, of course, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but he used to dip Christians in oil and then set them on fire, and as they was having his garden parties at night, they would be lit up by the Christians running around lit up on fire while they were sipping their martinis or whatever. And Beardsley apparently said, Nero set Christians on fire like large tallow candles, the only light Christians have ever known to give. And Wilde said, yes, that was the last time Christians were known to bring light into the world. You could see why they put him in prison. Now, Beardsley is a fascinating person. He was a very ill man. He died at 25 of tuberculosis, hemorrhaging, coughing up blood, and yet he did these extraordinary pictures. He became a Christian a year before he died. He became a Roman Catholic. Well, that was a popular thing then. It was like, incense and bells and smells and whatever. And these are not Christian drawings, as you can see. That's one for Aristophanes Lysistrata, and that's his extraordinary Oscar Wilde Salome. You know what she's doing there? Do you know the opera? How many of you know the opera, Richard Strauss's opera, Salome? What she's doing there is she's asked for the head of John the Baptist because she's become obsessed with him sexually, and she wants to kiss his lips. And she's kissing the lips of the skull of the head of John the Baptist, which has been brought to her. Pretty wild. All right, I'll end with Jessica here. Jessica Mitford comes from a mad family. They went from the one in the middle. Diana was married to Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the head of the British Fascist Party. She loved Hitler, constantly went to tea with Hitler. They were supporters of the fascists. On the other hand, Jessica at the end was in Spain fighting with the communists against Hitler. It was a very famous British family, and I love these two quotes. She says, "You may not be able to change the world, but at least you can embarrass the guilty." So today I've tried to embarrass the guilty, and if you ask, have I been objective? I've always had an objective.